John William Polidori was an English writer and physician, best known for his short novella, The Vampire, which became a significant influence on the vampire genre. Now, Polidori was born in London in 1795. He was the first of 8 children that were born to an Italian scholar, Gaetano Polidori, and his English wife, Anna Marie Pierce. Now, one of John's sisters, Frances Polidori, would later marry an exiled Italian scholar named Gabriele Rossetti, and thus Polidori became retrospectively the uncle of William Michael, Christina, and Dante Gabriele Rossetti. And William Michael would go on to play an important part later on in this story. Now, in 1815, at the age of 19, John Polidori graduated from the University of Edinburgh with his degree as a doctor of medicine after completing a dissertation on sleepwalking, which he wrote in Latin. Now, while modern medicine advises against suddenly waking a sleepwalker, Polidori, he had some other thoughts, suggesting that
methods should be applied that may rouse the sufferer from sleep by terrifying him. Beatings, electricity, frigid baths, if they are placed in such a way that the sufferer may fall into them when he strays from his bed in the course of sleepwalking, will perhaps hinder the return of his episodes.
Now, in 1816, Polidori was offered the opportunity to travel through Europe with his literary hero, Lord Byron, acting as Byron's personal physician. And to sweeten the deal, he was also paid £500 by Lord Byron's publisher, John Murray, to keep a journal of their travels. And it's this journal that William Michael Rossetti would later edit. Now, while Polidori was totally stoked about traveling with his literary hero, Polidori's father wasn't so keen on the idea. As a matter of fact, he forbade John to go. But John was very stubborn and arrogant, and he decided that he didn't care what his father said, and he refused to give up the opportunity to travel through Europe with Byron. But Polidori soon discovered that traveling with Byron, it wasn't really the dream job that he thought it was going to be. Byron is arrogant and moody and, a bit of a dick. Byron knew that Polidori admired him and had writing ambitions of his own, and Byron did everything in his power to crush them by telling him that, his writing sucked. He would further humiliate Polidori by referring to him as Dr. Polidori, but Polidori, he had his own share of hubris, and he actually considered himself on the footing of an equal with Byron. But nonetheless, the relationship between the two men quickly became toxic and deteriorated into one of equal contempt. Now, when Byron and Polidori arrived in Switzerland, they unexpectedly met up with Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, who was being referred to as Mrs. Shelley, her husband-to-be, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and much to Byron's chagrin, his pregnant former lover, Claire Clairmont. Now, if you've watched my other videos, you know that due to the eruption of Mount Tambora, the weather was pretty crappy that summer, and Byron and company spent most of their time indoors. Now, one night in June, Byron had been reading aloud from Phantasmagoriana, a French collection of German ghost stories, and that gave him the idea to challenge everyone to write a ghost story. Now, we all know that Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, but that's another video. Now, Byron began writing what is now called a fragment, which features a mysterious fellow by the name of Augustus Darvel. And Byron quickly grew tired of the story and he abandoned it after a couple of pages. But Polidori picked it up, and he used Byron's fragment to build his own novella, The Vampire, which became the first published modern vampire story in English. Now, I say modern vampire story because up until this time, vampires were considered hideous, gruesome creatures. And Polidori changed all that by making his vampire a gentleman. And so that's why you had stories like Dracula and Interview with the Vampire and Twilight and all the modern vampire stories where the vampires are usually very sexy and alluring. And that's because Polidori had changed the image of the vampire with his story. Now, Polidori's story, The Vampire, features the mysterious Lord Ruthven, a cruel and arrogant nobleman who takes great pleasure in the misery of others. And, well, you can probably guess who Polidori was inspired by. Now, The Vampire was published in 1819 in the New Monthly Magazine by a fellow named Henry Colburn. But this was without Polidori's permission. And to add insult to injury, it was credited to, you guessed it, Lord Byron. Now, neither Polidori or Byron were really happy about this. Polidori was outraged that it was published without his consent, considering he had never expressed a desire to even have it published. But he was even more enraged that credit was given to Byron. Polidori immediately wrote to Colburn, stating that,
I shall not sit patiently by and see it taken without my consent and appropriated by any person.
Now, Colburn didn't just publish it in his magazine. He also passed it on to publishers Sherwood, Neely, and Jones, who also released it in a hardback edition. Now, Colburn managed to get around Polidori's threat of legal injunction by having it reprinted as a tale related by Lord Byron to Dr. Polidori. And he also offered to draw up a contract in which Polidori would receive £300. The problem is that Colburn, well, he never got around to the writing up the contract bit. And when Polidori would try to get in contact with him, he was either out of town or just didn't respond. Now, Byron was equally incensed with being credited for the story, stating that he had
a personal dislike to vampires, and the little acquaintance I have with them would by no means induce me to divulge their secrets.
Though I suspect that Byron's real reason was that Polidori just wasn't a great writer, and he didn't want anyone to think that he had written the story. But after Polidori's death, Byron did admit,
the foundation of the story was mine, but I was forced to disown the publication, lest the world should suppose that I had vanity enough, or was egotist enough, to write in that ridiculous manner about myself.
Now, Byron and Polidori parted ways in September of 1816. However, in November of that year, the two would have a brief meeting when they were both in Milan, and Byron used his name to get Polidori released from police custody after Polidori had been involved in some kind of scuffle in a theater in Milan. Now, Byron admits he wasn't present at the time, but the circumstances led him to believe that Polidori was exceedingly in the wrong. Now, shortly afterwards, Polidori returned to England and intended to continue on with his medical career, but he shortly abandoned it and began studying for the bar. And also, at some point, Polidori had been involved in a carriage accident in which he suffered a severe head injury, which he never really fully recovered from. And on August 24th, 1821, only weeks away from his 26th birthday, John William Polidori committed suicide by drinking prussic acid. Now, in order to spare his family the shame and to allow John to be buried in the churchyard, the coroner's final verdict was that Polidori had died by the visitation of God. Upon hearing of Polidori's death, Byron wrote,
"Poor Polidori. It seems that disappointment was the cause of this rash act. He had entertained too sanguine hopes of literary fame."
Now, while Byron and Polidori didn't share literary greatness, what they did share was exactly what Byron had stated earlier, which was vanity and egotism. The introduction to Polidori's diary was written and edited by his nephew, William Michael Rossetti. Now, Rossetti had never met Polidori because he had been born 9 years after Polidori died. But he states that recorded notes about his uncle suggest that Polidori was deficient in self-knowledge, lacking in prudence and reserve, and had a quarrelsome attitude of mind. Perhaps the most tragic thing about Polidori's diary is that, well, as Rossetti tells us, a maiden aunt found some of the entries in the diary, both about Byron and about Polidori himself, objectionable. They were perhaps a bit too spicy to digest. So she decided to write out the journal, taking out those parts. And then afterwards, as Michael William Rossetti states, she ruthlessly destroyed the original manuscript. Now, sadly, even Polidori's mortal remains would have less than a peaceful interment. He was buried in St. Pancras churchyard and would later be, along with Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley's mother, one of the 7,000 graves disinterred to make room for the railway in the later part of the 1800s. His remains were placed in a box for reburial at a municipal site under the charge of a young and upcoming architect by the name of Thomas Hardy. Now, Polidori's short life was marked by professional and personal struggles. He faced financial difficulties, legal issues, and he suffered from depression. But despite his potential, he was unable to establish a lasting career in either medicine or literature. But his contribution to the Gothic literature through his short novella The Vampire has ensured his place in literary history. Now I wonder, have you read Polidori's work? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't, and you'd like to read it, I'll put a link to his story, his journal, and to Byron's fragment. And if you consider liking and subscribing, I'd be eternally grateful. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon on History by the Book. Bye-bye.